We're probably going to get started in about 2 to 3 minutes if you want to... Uh-oh, is that better? I didn't want to yell into the microphone. Is this better? Yes, okay, thank you for telling me. I'm realizing we don't actually have microphone. Yeah. Yeah, maybe someone's going to help us. So yeah, just a few more minutes and we'll get started. I think we're just waiting for a few more people to trickle in. I think we also don't have individual mics for the speakers, so that could be a problem. I could, yeah. They had several before. Oh, here we go. Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. We have 2 more. Oh, okay, No, we're all going to be sitting here. Yeah. Welcome in.
I feel like that person seems...
Yeah, he needs to know. Did you ask about the lunch?
Yeah.
All right. I think these are the final. I think we should get started if that's okay. Okay, great. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us for this session today. First, I want to just start by thanking Esther and Rachel and all the organizers for inviting us and for creating this space to talk about this truly important issue of immigration amidst so many other important issues that are being discussed today. You know, as Rachel referenced in her opening remarks, the last 13 months have been so deeply painful for refugees, for immigrants, and for the people who care about them and about their safety and their well-being. And that's because within hours of coming to office, the Trump administration stopped the long-standing bipartisan refugee resettlement program, stranding tens of thousands of vulnerable people, some of whom had tickets, bags packed, families awaiting them here in the US, communities waiting to welcome them. They've turned away people at the border who are fleeing unspeakable violence. They've shut down the life-saving pathway run by my own agency, HIAS, for Iranian Jews and other religious minorities in Iran to come to reunite with family members in the US, an issue which, of course, is now even more acute than it was then. And of course, most notoriously, they've dispatched masked men around the country to abduct people from their homes, from their cars, from the street, leaving immigrants, including people with legal status in this country, afraid to go to school, to go to work, to take their children to school, to pick up groceries. And now the administration's launching a new effort to arrest and indefinitely detain refugees, people who came the right way, as everyone says, who followed every process, who endured years of waiting, extreme vetting to come to the US and rebuild their lives here. They were promised safety and a chance to rebuild their lives in the US, and now they're being thrown back into chaos and fear. But we as a community are not taking these attacks lying down. Communities are standing up and they're fighting back, Synagogues, churches, mosques are working together to organize food pantries, to walk kids to school, to help accompany people to immigration appointments. My own organization, HIAS, is also fighting back. We are the Jewish community's refugee agency, and we're also the oldest refugee agency in the world. We've seen firsthand throughout the years what happens when people fleeing persecution are turned away and sent back into harm's way, and that's why we're not going to let it happen again. Just a quick word about HIAS. We were founded here in New York City at the turn of the 20th century by the Jewish community to rescue Jews who are fleeing persecution and violence, discrimination in Russia and Eastern Europe. In the 130, 140 years since then, we've helped millions of Jews to find safety, including my own grandparents, here in the US, in countries around the world, from Israel to Argentina. Anywhere that Jews could find a home, HIAS was there. And today, HIAS offers that same support, those same services to people of all faiths and all backgrounds, providing legal protection, advocacy, mental health, and psychosocial support, other forms of aid to help people integrate into their new homes so that people who are forced to flee their homes can rebuild in safety and in dignity. Our work is inspired by our community's own experience of displacement, as well as the Torah's commandment to welcome the stranger, something we're going to be talking more about today. Whereas we like to say we used to help refugees because they were Jewish, and today we help refugees because we are Jewish. But today we are facing an unprecedented challenge to our ability to fulfill this commitment. And I struggle with that word unprecedented because for so many communities, for so many among us, it's not unprecedented. If you ask the Japanese Americans who were interned, if you ask people of color, black immigrants and black people in this country, these are not unprecedented times. But in so many ways, the scope and the scale has reached an industrial level in a way that is new and is something that we have to challenge. So today is an opportunity to discuss how we can fulfill this commandment, how we can fight back, and I couldn't think of a better panel than the one we have here today. I may just allow each of them to introduce themselves. I think that might be nice, and then we'll get into questions, and we'll have about 20 minutes for question and answers, and then some final words from the panelists. But I'm going to first take a seat, and I should have introduced myself. My name is Noah Gottschalk. So sorry. I'm the Chief External Relations Officer at HIAS, based normally in Washington, D.C., and thank you all for joining us. So, Zoe.
Can everyone hear me okay? Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really gratified to see so many people here. I know that this is a conference about our ethical obligations as Jews with respect to Israel and Palestine, but I think that we also have ethical obligations as Jews beyond that. And I want to talk a little bit about immigration and our responsibilities as Jews and just the historical significance that Jews and the Holocaust has in the creation of immigration law in the United States. To introduce myself, my name is Zoe Schonfeld. I'm the attorney in charge of immigration at a nonprofit called the Center for Family Representation in New York City. We represent non-citizens in removal proceedings and in affirmative proceedings, non-citizens who might have collateral criminal cases or family defense cases. We also represent children and families and children who are being held in detention in the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So just to go back a bit and talk about other than the Jewish values, I think, that compel us to think and care about immigration and the immigrant and the refugee, there's also contemporary history that is relevant in the creation of immigration law in the United States. Up until 1965, there was a quota system for immigration, and that was the basis of how the United States made a determination about whether and how people would be admitted into the country. In 1938, for example, when Austrians and Jews began trying to flee what was beginning to happen in Germany and Austria, many of them tried unsuccessful to apply for visas and were turned away because there had been a national quota set for German and Austrian immigrants at 27,000. The exclusion of people based on race and national origin was pretty defining for the United States, and I think we probably all know the story in 1939 of the famous St. Louis, where 900 Jews who actually made it to the port of Miami were turned back, and many of them were killed. It wasn't until after the Holocaust that the notion of these principles of needing to accept and provide sanctuary for people fleeing countries where they would not be safe was actually converted into being obligations for and a system of international human rights laws. It might surprise some of you to know that the United States did not accede to any convention on refugees until 1968, and until 1980, there was no domestic law in the United States to protect asylees or asylum seekers and refugees. It wasn't until the Refugee Act of 1980 that it became codified into domestic law. But over the course of the last 60 years, it has been. And this notion that we are a country which provides rights and protections for people regardless of their national origin is now, I think, or until 13 months ago, has been firmly entrenched into the way we think about our country and the way we think about the principles and the obligations that our country has to immigrants. As Noah was saying, in the last 13 months since Trump has come to power, there has been a backsliding. And what I want to note and reflect is the way in which this backsliding, one, undercuts existing rules and laws that we have, that Congress has legislated, and two, the way that the xenophobia and the language of this current moment so much resembles the exclusionary, xenophobic, nativist, and racist, and anti-Semitic language that preceded this jurisprudence around asylum and refugee law that is really only very recent. One of the things that Noah was describing has been happening undercover, or with the pretext on the part of this administration as being necessary to protect our country against invasion. It's very hard to take seriously the administration's stated goals early on in Trump's campaign that he was going to get rid of the worst of the worst when, as Noah described, the people who are now in limbo are people who are families who are seeking asylum from other countries in which they were not safe. One of the things that I want to underscore in particular is that much of what is going on to undercut the protections that have existed for the last 70 years is not something that we see every day. Of course, everyone has seen what happened in Minnesota and in Minneapolis and has seen the ICE raids and the detention. But what I want to also make very, very clear is that the actual legal protections that existed for years are being rolled back. And the principle that, that was codified in the Refugee Act of 1980, which is that anyone who comes here, regardless of how they entered, lawfully or otherwise, who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin because of persecution, because of nationality, race, religion, political opinion, or a particular social group, that person, those people are eligible to seek asylum through a process that is procedurally quite established. And it is those rights that were, again, codified, that we all had pacted on and agreed upon as a country that, that holds these values dear, that are being rolled back. One very small example that I just want to give, which isn't, I think, necessarily something that is in the forefront of everyone's awareness, is that something that is happening right now is that asylum seekers who have been waiting to have their cases litigated for months and often years are being prevented from actually having their day in court, because the administration has quite cynically created third country agreements with many, many countries that are not safe refuges for people who are here seeking asylum, in something called asylum cooperative agreements, which include agreements with countries like Uganda and El Salvador, countries that do not have functioning asylum systems. And because of these pacts, people who are coming to court expecting to have their day to prove that they have in fact been persecuted in their country of origin are instead being told that their cases are going to be pretermitted, closed, and that they will not have the opportunity to put on a case because there exists some third country, a country that they have never probably set foot in, where their claim can be heard. And in this way, the people that were promised and relied on the promise of the United States to provide them with refuge are being foreclosed from those things. And again, I want to highlight that this is part of a very clear strategy on the part of this administration to make America more white, more like the country that Stephen Miller wants it to be, and not for any reason that of national security. Right, and as Noah was describing how the refugee resettlement has been paused, but obviously we have all heard, but for South African whites, they are still able to avail themselves of the refugee system.
Thank you so much. I think you said so many important things, but two things that I just wanted to sort of pull out of that really struck me. The first is, what could be more American than the idea that everyone has the right to have their day in court, and the fact that that's even being taken away. And you used to be a public defender. That is not, maybe people don't realize that refugees, or asylum seekers, I should say, who are going through this process don't have access to legal counsel as under the law. They are representing themselves often, explaining their own traumatic incidents, their own traumatic experiences, to try to make that case, and even that ability is being taken away from them. The other really, I think, interesting point that you made is about the fact that the law doesn't discriminate as to the way that someone got into the country. So in my opening remarks, I used air quotes for anyone who wasn't looking at me when I said it. There is no right way to come to this country and claim asylum. It's about why you're here, what you fled, right? And I think that was such an important point. So thank you for those remarks. Turning to Rabbi Berman, now that we have a clear understanding of the U.S. law and framework, can you guide us a little bit more through the halachic framework and how Torah and Jewish law shape our understanding of immigration and our obligation towards immigrants.
So I'm Saul Berman, and I teach Jewish studies at Stern College, and I teach a seminar on Jewish law at Columbia Law School, and I've been around for a long time. Many years ago, I wrote a very lengthy article on the issue of immigration in Jewish law, which I will attempt to summarize for you in about less than 10 minutes. Its focus really is the comparison of the ancient world to what Torah attempted to do. That is, in the ancient world, we know that, particularly in the ancient Near East, but also in the ancient West, that immigrants had virtually no rights whatsoever. Not only did they have no rights, they had no fundamental protections. In virtually every ancient criminal code, in which homicide was a crime, it was not necessarily a crime. In fact, usually was not a crime if it was done to someone who was a stranger. And if it was a crime, then the penalty for it was much less than whatever the penalty was for having taken the life of a citizen. And so on in virtually every area of ancient law, the stranger had limited, if any, rights whatsoever. And I believe that the Torah attempted to turn that system on its head. And it did so initially in the narratives in Sefer Bereshit. By my count, close to 40% of the narratives in the book of Genesis are essentially stories about immigration, and they lay out for us, one after another, why people emigrate, what the challenges are that they find when they immigrate, and how they respond to those challenges, how they deal with the vulnerabilities that are created for them. And so to begin with, I mean, sometimes, and the story is not significantly different from the way it is today. And anybody who reads the newspapers today will see the same fundamental pattern. 3,500 years later, after Matan Torah, close to 4,000 years later after the life of Avraham. Right, so Avraham himself emigrates a number of times, right? He first emigrates because of a divine command, right? For a vision of a wonderful life, right? And we're familiar with that. People who emigrate because they have this vision that, the country that they come to will be a country of freedom, a country in which they can make new lives for themselves. But they also come because of famine. Avram confronted that problem, right? He had a famine, and so he fled. And what happened when he went, both times, when he went to Egypt and once when he went to Gaza, right? He confronted the same problem, and that is the likelihood that they would take his wife and rape her or do whatever they wanted with her, and that if he resisted, they would kill him, right? That's a relatively serious vulnerability to have to confront, right? And what Avram did, and what Avram and Sarah did together, both in at least in one, if not both of the narratives, is that they lied. Right? They lied because that was the only way that they had to protect themselves. They had no choice in regard to their escape in terms of their having to be there, but they needed to protect themselves, and they protect themselves by lying. The same thing happens, of course, even to the strangers who showed up at Avram's home and then went on from his home to Lot. And there in the city of Sodom, they met up with the same kind of greeting, right? I mean, the attempt at homosexual rape against them, and they used violence in order to protect themselves, because what they're supposed to do, allow themselves to be killed, whoever they were, and so on. The narratives of the Torah are sort of filled with this. Yitzchak leaves, right? Also famine. He goes to Gerar. Same thing, threat of rape and murder. He then experiences what immigrants always experience, and that is the deprivation of legal protection, because after all, he dug wells, And what happened to the wells that he dug? Well, the neighbors claimed that they were their wells. They owned the water, right? He didn't own the land. He was therefore not entitled to the water either. And he had no legal protection, much as Avram had no legal protection when he wanted to buy a burial place for his wife, Sarah, and realized that, if he makes a private deal with the owner of this piece of land, there's no way that he will ever be able to protect himself if the person then claims that he was defrauded or was not paid, right? And so he insists on doing what? On engaging in that transaction as a public transaction before the elders of the town. At least he's got a fighting chance that way of the event not being able to be denied, right? And it just goes on, story after story in the Torah tells us the same kinds of patterns. But at the same time, the Torah is sort of setting up a counter-narrative. What's the counter-narrative? Well, the counter-narrative is Avram welcomes strangers, right? 3 strangers show up to Avram, and he rushes out to greet them. And he offers them, to wash their feet and to give them food to eat. And he engages his entire family, right, in preparing the food and in making these strangers feel welcome, right? And that's the beginning of a counter-narrative that the Torah sets up. And it then continues to show us periodically that counter-narrative was typical for Avram's family, even though it was atypical for the world in which they lived. And so even Lot, living in Sodom, right there in Sodom on the verge of its destruction with all of its evil, and Lot could not have had, his eyes were clearly not closed to what was going on around him, right? He knew what happens in his town, right? Nevertheless, he invited the strangers into his home, right? According to the Midrash, against the will of his wife, right? And so there's a struggle there, right? Because it's not so simple to engage your family in doing it. He wasn't even able to convince his sons-in-law to flee with him, right? I mean, he's got a problem, but nevertheless he insisted on this is what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to welcome strangers. And even subsequently in the life of Avram, when Avram needs to choose a wife for his son Yitzchak, right? And he sends whoever that Eved Avram was, whether it was Eliezer or somebody else, sends him to back to the ancestral home to find a wife. There's only one quality that Eliezer, let's call him, knows of that he has to find in order for that woman to be an appropriate wife for Yitzchak. And what is that quality? That she'll welcome strangers. Right? Isn't that extraordinary? So you have this sort of setup in the Torah of here, here's the way in which the world treats immigrants and the vulnerabilities to which they're exposed as a result, and the difficult decisions they have to make, and the kinds of actions that they will sometimes take in order to protect themselves under that kind of threat. And they'll lie, and they'll negotiate, but they may even have to use violence, and so they'll try chastisement even when it doesn't work. Right? Both Avraham and Yitzchak tried chastisement, and it doesn't work. They'll do public negotiations. They'll try to do things to protect themselves. But at the same time, there's this counter-narrative that's being set up for us in the Torah, and that is that the family of Avraham has a different approach to this. That the family of Avraham understands that they have to welcome strangers into their homes, and they have to feed them, they have to take care of them, and as it were, guide them on their subsequent path. And of course, that, even further in the life of Jacob, right? I mean, Jacob flees, right? Why does he flee? He doesn't immigrate willingly. He doesn't choose because there was a great vision in his life. His brother wanted to kill him, right? And he knew he couldn't stay there. His mother told him that his brother wants to kill him, and he had better flee because she couldn't protect him and didn't think that father was going to protect him. So, he's got to run to a different country. And so he runs to a different country, and of course, what does he find there? Constant deception. And how does Yaakov respond to that? By working extra hard, right? By working extra hard. He does not even bring, when one of the sheep is killed, he doesn't bring the sheep back and blame, the wolves or whoever it was who killed the sheep. He assumes economic responsibility for that because he knows he's a stranger. He's subject to deception, right? He gets deceived in regard to his wife. He gets deceived in regard to his salary. He's repeatedly deceived. He even learns to do some of that himself. He had some of that in him already, had shown a proclivity to doing that. And so he counter-deceives, right? Because he has to protect himself. He counter-deceives. It just sort of goes on and on. I mean, the narratives, you're all familiar with all of the narratives, right? The jealousy of Lavan's sons, echoing the jealousy of the citizens of Gerar who wanted to expel Yisrael, and Lavan's sons, right? Jacob's own cousins and I get brothers-in-law, are jealous of his success. Right? Because he's still a stranger. He's a grina still. Right? He's really a grina. And even when he comes back to Israel, because he can't tolerate that life that he has out there anymore, and he comes back to sort of come back to the old home, but he still comes back a grina. Right? Because what happens to him right away? His daughter is raped. And when his sons, who grew up as natives where they were living, who didn't know that you have to be submissive, who thought that you have to fight for your rights, when they decided they were going to attack Shechem, what does Jacob do? Jacob says, what, are you kidding? No. All the whole neighborhood is going to gang up on us and they're going to all wipe us out. Right? So you have to remain silent. You have to be submissive. Right? And so you see, even in the lives of immigrants, these competing kinds of how do you resolve those? When do you use violence and when do you just submit and let people get away with doing evil to you? And the life of Joseph, just to culminate this, Joseph emigrates because he was sold as a slave, right? And so he's got to make a new life for himself as a slave. And he can't go back to where he came from because he knew his brothers were out to kill him. And as a slave, he knows that nobody has any responsibility for him. Not even the guy who, he predicted that the guy would be okay, and the guy was okay. He's experienced that relief, and he had no duties left to Joseph, right? But how did Joseph make it in Mitzrayim? How did Joseph make it in Mitzrayim? He made it because he had a skill that was really valuable to the king. But in order for the king to even accept him, to serve him in that way, he had to do what? He had to first shave his beard off. He had to dress him in Egyptian garb. He had to put jewelry on him, and when he wanted him to occupy a position of grandeur, he had to do what? He had to also give him a horse and chariot that was appropriate for his status in the society, and marry him off to the wife of a local priest. Right? So, and Joseph doesn't resist all of that because he knows what's he going to do? Not become part of the society in which he has now had this opportunity to make it. And of course, Jacob ends up not even be able to identify his grandchildren when he sees them before he dies. So, the difficulty in these stories is really extraordinary. But it's clear that the Torah is aiming someplace with all of this. It's not just telling us these stories so we should be sympathetic to people or not be sympathetic to people. The Torah uses this as the foundation for a set of laws that are then legislated in the subsequent Sfarim, in Shmot, in Vayikra, in Bamidbar, in Dvarim. 36 separate times when the Torah legislates laws related to the ger, right? The stranger. And it's striking that the Torah uses the same word, ger, for both the geographic stranger, geographic immigrant, and the spiritual immigrant. Same word. Because, people's attitude toward immigrants not necessarily distinguish between geographic immigrants and spiritual immigrants. Talk to any ger and they'll be able to tell you about that, right? And what does the Torah do in those 36 psukim? You know what the Torah does? It guarantees the safety of the life of gerim. It guarantees their physical well-being and security from being beaten or physically abused, including raped. It guarantees the safety of their property, right? It guarantees their right to legal process. And it guarantees even their right to emotional equanimity. If you review the laws of the Torah in which the Torah legislates related to the ger, all of that is then contained right there, because what the Torah has decided to do is to turn the system on its head. You had an opportunity to see what it was really like for the stranger. We're going to transform that radically. Instead, they're going to be entitled to the security of their lives. They'll be entitled not to be abused. They'll be entitled to the protection of their property, and they'll be able to use the legal system to gain their rights. And they will even be guaranteed their emotional equanimity, so that crimes which are fundamentally emotional crimes cannot be performed against them. It's in that way that I think we have to understand what the Torah is attempting to do and the kind of model it's attempting to shape for us. So there's more of this, but another time. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Berman. That was truly a tour de force. Thank you so much, Rabbi Berman. Now that we've had this incredible deep dive into what our faith says about the ger, about the immigrant, about the stranger, I want us to zoom out a little bit. When I've had the opportunity to work with different faith traditions, what's so striking is they all have a liturgic or a faith basis for the importance of welcoming the stranger and supporting immigrants. And Rabbi Moskowitz, you know that better than most, and the ways that the Jewish communities work in this area is but one of the many aspects of a really rich tapestry of interfaith work. So I was hoping you can tell us a little bit more about that work as you introduce yourself, and I want to just assure, as we move towards the second round of questions, we're going to be focusing on what we can all do here. We want this to be a learning panel, but also an action panel. And no shame to anybody, but if you have to leave, there's some sheets up here of paper where you can grab one and learn ways to plug in here in New York City in particular, but around the country as well. So feel free to take that if you do have to go. So thank you. Rabbi Moskowitz, over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. I'm Mike Moskowitz. I'm the Director of Scholarship and Multi-Faith Engagement at the Beacon, which is a project of Union Theological Seminary. And I think one of the kind of great universal truths is that the way we treat other people says a lot about our theology and worldview. In the Jewish tradition, every ben adam l'chaverei is a ben adam l'makom. Every mitzvah that's interpersonal is itself a commandment between us and the divine, and that's true in the non-Jewish world as well. Rabbi Chanan says that derech eretz kadma l'Torah, the idea of being a refined human being, having proper character traits, is a prerequisite for learning Torah. He says that's true for the Zayin Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, right? To be a good non-Jew in the world, for the 7 Noahide laws, also requires a kind of refinement of character. And I would say in most religions, certainly the Abrahamic ones, theologically, if we want to have a relationship with God as a parent, then a consequence of that is that we have to take care of all of God's children as our siblings. And when we look at the world today and the way in which we are treating so many of God's children, like this is just not how you treat family, much less another human being. So I want to kind of share what I think from faith-based traditions is kind of the most global worldview in this moment as a way of both combating and restoring kind of faith. And Judaism sees faith as a call to action. To the extent that we believe, it's to the extent that we can take on the precarity, right, to do what we know is right and not have to deal with the consequences. The idea of divine support, divine intervention, is obviously differs between different faith-based traditions, but ultimately feeling the divine presence accompanying us on the work that we're doing is, I think, essential to doing this work. If not, it's really isolating and it's really alone. It's a feeling of being alone. To quote a few more kind of, I think, global traditions, particularly the ones that the Rabbi has mentioned, and also exploring the texture of time in this moment, Judaism sees the destruction, the Churban, as the natural consequence of a lack of Chabura, right? It says the roots there are anagrams, as a lack of a cohesive network. And so when we think about how we see the dehumanization, right, the mass production of dehumanization today in America, the religious response is to reclaim human dignity, right, in really broad ways. To say that a little bit differently, we're seeing micro-affections move from the micro to the macro, right? It's not just the small accumulations of things which make it harder to be a human in the world, that by the end of the day we're just exhausted. But it's really kind of very explicit, very overt. So one of the things that we can do, and this is true just theologically of all religions, is to move into a space of proactive micro-affections, right? What does it mean to rehumanize people, seeing people as being created in the image of the divine? So that can be a smile, that can be acts of kindness. In our tradition, Sever Panim Yafa is we often don't translate the word savor, right? It's a language of svar, it's a language of kind of a thoughtful approach to kindness. The Talmud tells us that the Hebrew Bible both begins and ends with kindness, with with God clothing Adam and Eve after the sin, and then with the burying of Moses. And the altar of Slobodka, actually the Mishkiach of Slobodka points out in Teres Avram that when we think about the Torah, the Hebrew Bible beginning with kindness, after the garden is a strange place to kind of put a pin in, like God was kind here, as opposed to just the creation of the world or the Garden of Eden, very literally paradise. And so he says that when it comes to being kind to people, what God is modeling is that we're not meant to be kind with people who believe in the same God, right? Because Adam and Eve, when God said no, they didn't listen, right? So it's particularly for those who we view as being in opposition to our worldview, for those who perhaps destroyed or destroying the world that God self tried to create. It's particularly in those places that we have to kind of afford kindness in really explicit ways. And it's not coincidental, as the Rabbi pointed out, that when we think about Abrahamic traditions, right, the role of kindness is what's ascribed to Abraham. Tradition has it that when Abraham invited the guests, it was Passover time. It's actually this season. We're coming up to Holy Week. It's also, Ramadan happens to correspond right now. But there also, Abraham thought that these were idol worshippers. And there the Alter Rebbe points out that learning from God, Abraham approached each person as if they were the center of the universe, giving each one of them a tongue, right? Giving them each one kind of their own deli menu, as it were, even though it was Pesach. But that's the minhag. It's brought down that we have 3 different matzahs, Leil Pesach, because of our understanding that it was Leil Pesach, but the role of inviting guests. And I think that explains a lot of the way in which we read the Haggadah. Anyone who's hungry, let them come and eat. And it really kind of reclaims the obligation of inviting guests. The Talmud tells us in Gittin that the temple was destroyed because of a person getting the Kamsin Bar Kamsa story, where somebody got the wrong invitation. And so we declare anyone who's hungry, let them come and eat. And then we establish that this year we're here in exile because of the destruction, the Churban, the lack of Chabura. But now, because we're now inviting all of the people, we can reclaim that. And next year we're going to be in Jerusalem, right? And this is something that I think every religion understands, that the ask right now is not about the differences of, my God, the God of my ancestors, yours, God, to the exclusion of my God. But how do we see people as children of God? How do we see humanity as being worthy intrinsically of value because of God in the world? And even those who don't believe in a kind of a monotheistic faith and think about the world in terms of the ethical components, there are many people who feel this sense of allyship right now, not from a self-centered place of, if I don't stand up for others, then who's going to stand up for me, but because of the moral imperative. That part of what it means to be a good human in this world is to elevate humanity, particularly those whose humanity is at risk. And maybe just one other kind of insight. I come from a tradition where the insights provide an outlook, and so I hope some of this is a little bit helpful. But the word that we have for the word other, acher, is first deployed actually when one brother kills the other, and the verse can be read homiletically because of the othering. But those 3 words also are the root of the word for guest. And so there's a spectrum of how we see people. Either we see ourselves as being kind of guests of the divine in this world, and therefore wanting to be godly, we also invite others, and we protect them, and we provide for them the way in which Abraham modeled what it meant to invite guests, the way in which he understood from God what it means to be kind, particularly for those who have a different worldview, or we other. And the natural consequencing of others is death and violence.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much. We're going to move now to what we're going to do about this part of the discussion. So excited to kick off that part with Zoe. You know, in your day-to-day work with immigrants, I'm sure you see so many issues, so many gaps. What do you see as the most critical right now, and how can people here help to fill them?
So I love that this is a half law, half religious panel, because I think that, as Rabbi Berman described, there is a way that we legislate the world that we want to live in. And I think that these values that we've been talking about of humanism are, as I said earlier, values that have been enshrined in our laws, both domestically and internationally. The civil rights movement made sure that rights were not simply available to a certain group of people, but were available to all. And similarly, international human rights law underscores that there are some basic human rights that people are entitled to. And the country that that many of us have been born into and have grown up in is a country that until recently promised us all this possibility, the possibility that we would be protected. And I think it's really important to get really concrete here. The rule of law is being rolled back under this administration, and the ways in which we recognize that everyone has a right to certain basic things is being rolled back. So I think that what can we do? We have to do something, and you're all here, so here you are, ready to do something, and that's amazing. I think that part of what you can do is actually quite in line with what Rabbi Berman and Rabbi Moskowitz have been talking about, which is the effort to actually have human experiences. In my work, what I see is a ton of cruelty, and it is enraging. The other day, I went to an ICE check-in with a woman and her 3 children, and while I was waiting in 26 Federal Plaza, there was that moment that we've all read about and seen where a young child is clinging to his father and weeping and saying, "Please don't go away, please don't leave me." And then there's a phalanx of ICE officers with their gaiters up, surrounding them, walking around them, as if this isn't something that needs to be stopped, something that they shouldn't be participating in. And as much as I have, read the stories and even seen the video evidence, being present in that moment and witnessing it makes me really fucking mad. And I think you all need to get really fucking mad, because what's happening should not be happening on our watch. So here's some concrete things that I think I would suggest that people could do. I think it's really important to hook up with communities that already exist and are already doing this work. You don't need to invent the wheel. There are plenty of clinics who are providing pro se support for asylum seekers and other types of immigrants who are trying to figure out a path to avoid getting detained and deported. If you're not a lawyer, you can still provide services, scribing, and if you have other skills, like language skills, you can provide translation. If any of you work in mental health services, you can volunteer your services to do evaluations for asylum seekers. But also, you should be in the room with people who are non-citizens, who are experiencing this moment, and you should, as the panelist on the plenary panel said, you should try to see it through their eyes, because really nothing is the same. The other thing is that there are people who are fighting this fight, and you should support them. And they are, by and large, lawyers. And the reason lawyers are so important in this moment is because a lot of the pernicious things that this administration is doing is unraveling protections that exist. For example, one of the humanitarian protections that has been enshrined in our laws, in our legal system since 1990, is temporary protected status. And this is something that presidents since Bush have been able to do to provide exactly what it sounds like, temporary protected status for people from countries who are experiencing some kind of national trauma, either politically or environmentally. They are able to stay here, be protected from detention and deportation, and they're able to work and survive. Recently, this administration has taken the unprecedented step of rolling back and canceling temporary protected status for countries who are still in the throes of different crises. Haiti, Somalia, Venezuela. These are countries whose citizens continue to need safety. And when the administration announces unilaterally that it's taking these unprecedented steps and not going through the proper procedure, lawyers file lawsuits, and we should all support them because they are keeping their fingers in the dike. To quote a recent judge who made that statement. Other things that can be done. There are people need lawyers, and as Noah said, people don't have the right to immigration defense, even when they're facing the harshest civil penalty of deportation and potential family separation. And we want the state and our city to do what the federal government is not doing. So we can support individual law firms or legal service providers, or we can support legislation on the state and local level and pass, for example, New York for immigrant families, a law that would require the state and local government to pay for attorneys. The other thing that we can and we should do is we should protest, we should resist, we should be in the streets. We know what this looks like. We've seen this before. As one of the panelists said, for me this feels like the Shoah. I see cruelty and discrimination and racism and families who are being separated. And this is the time to be in the streets and to show up and to fight against this. Because this is not the country that I want to live in, and I know it can be better.
Yeah, I want to move to Rabbi Moskowitz. The same question. I want to build on that incredible momentum from you, Zoe. Thank you so much. And thank you for everything that you're doing and for the work that you're doing both on an individual level to support these people, but also the ways that you represent all of us when you're in court and when you're with people. So thank you. And so Rabbi Moskowitz, in your work, where do you see opportunities for us?
So I have to agree that the most important thing really is showing up. God identifies as God's self at the divine revelation as the one who's there to liberate us, right? God didn't outsource that. We said in the Haggadah, I am not an angel, I am not an emissary. So there's no substitute for showing up. There's also no substitute for proximity and real relationship building, right? As a proof text, the verse says about Joseph that the brothers saw him from afar and sought to kill him. That from a distance, it's much easier to dehumanize somebody, right? So we want to counter that with getting to know people, right? Understanding the lived experiences of others. It's not coincidental that it's in that act of othering the brother that we ultimately descend into Egypt and are enslaved, right? In other words, this is a cycle of what happens when we dehumanize people. And so ultimately the liberation and the story of liberation is one of shifting from discrimination and oppression to equality. So I think right now there are three major asks. One is organizing, right? the other side is really well funded, has a lot of power, and has systems upon systems in place. And so we need to be able to work together. In the Genesis narrative, the Sforno points out the shift from Tov to Tov Ma'od, that when good people and good things work together, it becomes exponentially good. So we each have power, we each have privilege, we have to network the needs and the resources, but when we work together, it's the only way that we're going to be successful. Particularly being willing to organize with people that we might have really big disagreements with, right? Like once we save democracy and save, right, those who are really in this urgent space, then we can kind of go back to this debating and discussing and arguing as democracy necessitates the finer points of it. But this is not nuanced, right? This is kind of it's interesting in the Ten Commandments, which are not two sets of five, right? The interpersonal and the godly are one. There are many more words on the first five. Right? When it comes to the second five of interpersonal stuff, it's all like short one-liners, right? Like don't do this, don't do that, right? Kill, murder, etc. So Chazal said that when they came down, the luchas came down, the stuff about being nice to each other was like very big, right? In terms of the occupation of space, where the stuff with the God, like that requires a kind of finer attention. This stuff doesn't require finer attention, I think. The second category, which I think is really important beyond the organizing, is the role of faith in us being able to feel not just a sense of clarity, moral clarity, and that we need a moral revival and a consistency of solidarity. But it also, I think, needs to inform how we do this, right? By any means necessary is not a Jewish value. The way that we do things is really, really, really important. So when we think about how we protest, right? We have to machamacha. But we have to make a Kiddush Hashem while we're doing it, right? In other words, the V'chila Hashem is the void, literally the absence of the divine presence, which is what we're seeing. So we need to fill that space with holiness. We need to reclaim those spaces as divine spaces. And the third, and I know this is a little bit hard because we do need to be mad, but we need to do something with that rage. And I think joy is an act of both spiritual and political resistance, right? We need to be able to lean into the arts and into humanities and to support all of those which are being defunded, not just for our own survival as they defund science research and these things, but when we think about how is it that we can shift in our heads our ability to cope by attempting to affect change, right? There needs to be a way in which we are nourished by this work, right? Because the chaos is exhausting, right? Every single day it wears away at our foundation. The more that we can reinforce our connection to the wisdom of our tradition, the more that we can reinforce that, I think the more that we become better equipped, but also that we can be in this for the long haul, right? This is not going to end tomorrow. I mean, we believe with perfect faith that it could very well end tomorrow. But in terms of the shtadlis that we're supposed to put in, so part of what that means is, I think, showing up in places that require relationship building, in places of faith. So, for example, I was just at an Ash Wednesday, which was not on the syllabus in Yeshiva, on how to show up for those things. But I was at 26 Federal Plaza with wonderful people of good faith. And there were intersections there. There were some wonderful queer clergy there that were offering glitter in the ashes, right? Which is, again, not something that I studied in terms of the parameters of what's valid. There's a minig by us, by the chasana, we put in the makkah with the tefillin, we put ashes, but I've never seen it with glitter. But you never know. The next queer wedding, two guys, maybe I'll go upon him. When we think about meeting this moment, I think we need to meet this moment with the totality of who we are, right? Just to conclude on this point, when we think about kindness in this world, like I said before, the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says, Al shleish devarim ha'olam omed, three things the world stands. Torah is in the singular, avodah is in the singular, but it's acts of loving kindness. It's gimel chasadim in the plural, because it's not meant to be something you can check a box for, right? It's not that like I did this thing, but we're meant to be agents of change for goodness in the world. And then part of that is just a paradigm shift in how we move about the world, how we see ourselves as being interconnected with society.
Well, I find myself blown away by every intervention and struggling to sort of say anything intelligent, but that how matters felt so powerful, and I think it's a great segue to Rabbi Berman. You were a leader in the Soviet Jewry movement. You put your body on the line in the civil rights movement. I think I see a Save Darfur bracelet peeking out from under your suit. Can you share a little bit with us how that activism relates to your observance and what lessons it has for us in this moment, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience.
No, because then we won't have any time for questions. I would like to just pick up on something that Rabbi Moskowitz just said. Because in over the past couple of years, there's been an enormous challenge that students on campuses have confronted, which I think adults feel also in the community, and that is sort of this struggle around intersectionality and the claim that many, particularly college-based communities make, that you're either with us or against us. You're sort of either part of the oppressors or you're part of the oppressed. And if you're a Zionist, you're part of the oppressors, so go away, right? We don't want you here. So my claim to student groups when I've met with them to talk about this, and I want to just share the same thing with you now, is that we should not allow ourselves to be pushed out of the commitments that we have to doing good in this world. And that we can't, that we have to insist on being there and insist on doing the work that needs to be done. I remember I don't know if I've ever mentioned, I may have mentioned this at one point or another, but there was a point in time I was rabbi of the Young Israel of Brookline outside of Boston, just for a couple of years in the late 1960s and early 1970s. I was approached at the time by a small group of young men who wanted to create a chapter of Jewish, the JDL, the Jewish Defense League, which was Meir Kahana's organization. They wanted to create a chapter of it in the Boston area, and they came to see me because they wanted my support in that. And so I asked them what they wanted to do and stuff like that, and we talked for a while, and they said, okay, so we would really like your support in doing this. And I told them, well, if you decide to establish a chapter, I will be glad to condemn you from the public, from the pulpit. And they were sort of a little bit taken aback by my response to them. And I told them that I admired some of Meir Kahana's thinking and his desire to help protect Jews, but that I found that the way in which he went about it was not just counterproductive, but contrary to everything that I believed needed to be done by Jews in the real world, and that you don't make friends by making enemies of everybody in the real world, and that you don't use violence in situations in which you don't have to use violence, and a variety of other things like that, and they then sort of left. They were upset with me, but they came back a couple of weeks later, and they said, listen, are there any conditions under which you would join us? Because they said, what we want to do, we want to help Soviet Jewry, and we want to help, Jews who are in trouble. So are there any conditions under which you would join us? So I said, yes, there are, actually. I said, if you were committed to absolute nonviolence, and secondly, if you commit yourself to proposition, that is even in Soviet Jewry demonstrations and other circumstances, and that you commit yourself to working collaboratively with non-Jewish communities, including the black community. So I figured that would drive them sufficiently out of their minds to... So they showed up at my home, about 2 weeks later, and they said, listen, National JDL told us that Rabbi Kahana said, no way, forget about this, there's no way we would ever agree to those kinds of terms. They said, but we want to tell you that we want to create this chapter, and that we as a chapter are willing to commit ourselves to those principles. So I said, okay, that's very good. So they said, well, so will you join our steering committee? So I said yes. And we then did, for those 2 years that I was there in Boston, some really quite extraordinary things related to Soviet Jewry, number of which, the government should have records of in the FBI files because they tapped our phones and stuff like that. It was not, my wife used to, when she was sharing recipes with friends over the phone, would say, guys, did you get this one down? It's really a good recipe. But more important even than the work that we did for Soviet Jewry was that we created, for the first time in that area, community patrols for Dorchester and Mattapan. Dorchester and Mattapan were two old Jewish neighborhoods which were being emptied. There were lots of Jews who were left there as the area became black and the crime rate began to constantly increase. Of course, the major victims of that crime increase were blacks themselves, but Jews were stuck in that situation as well. And we were able to work with the black clergy to create civilian patrols in conjunction, the Jewish community, the black community, and the police department, working closely with the police department with unarmed patrols that had immediate access to the police. And so they would drive around, every night with a couple of what we used to call kanchayas, but some civilized ones, who were willing to agree to those kinds of terms in which if they saw something going on, if it looked like it could break into violence, that they had to call the police. They couldn't do anything themselves. And it had an enormous impact in the community. The truth of the matter is that, living as we do here in the United States, we need allies. If we want to protect ourselves as well as the community in which we live, then we need to learn how to work with other organizations to achieve concrete purposes in ways that either people have not thought of doing before. We are really smart people, right? We can figure out ways to get things done that need to be done in a collaborative process, in which the most fundamental thing is that we don't have to give up our principles, that we can sustain our principles and partner with others even when we disagree with them. Who could disagree more than we disagree with the Catholic Church, right? But the Catholic priests were in on this one in Boston, right? They were not necessarily happy about it, right? Because they were really under pressure because of the stuff that was happening then in the Catholic Church. But nevertheless, we have the capacity to work with people collaboratively to achieve things, and that's what we need to seek to do.
Thank you, Rabbi. So we've got about five minutes left. I want to ask us to take 3 questions. So if you have a top 3 most important question, raise your hand. I see 3 men who've raised their hand. Have any women have top 3? Great, thank you. And then we're going to take them all at once, and then we're going to ask all the panelists to sort of take the one that resonates with you. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Ellie Shava. Thanks, you guys all, for a wonderful panel. I'm going to put aside Zoe's question because I think that the questions of supporting lawyers are targeted and were well articulated. The question of collaborating with other community groups, this is to a large extent a New York-centric group, a New York Jewish, in some cases Upper West Side-centric community group. There are Brooklyn people here, there are local people here. Where should we be going? I see my feed is full of Christian organizations organizing a sing for solidarity. I don't see this yet happening in Jewish organizations that are building those collaborative presences. Do you have places, what's the link I should click on to start to know where I show up to do that collaborative work?
Hi, my question is primarily for Rabbi Moskowitz, but anyone on the panel can take this. I really appreciate the way Zoe articulated that fucking fury that a lot of us are feeling looking at what ICE is doing, ravaging the communities adjacent to us. And Rabbi Moskowitz, your answer to fill that space with joy, to me it really feels insufficient. When I see this, I want to take these guys in a back alley and beat the shit out of them. That's what I want to do to these ICE agents. And obviously that's not possible, but I guess that comes from a visceral place, obviously. But I think there's also a rational argument to be made. After the Holocaust in Germany, there were Nuremberg trials, and that is what allowed ultimately for accountability and for German society to do teshuvah in a way that I think the U.S. never did after the Civil War, where we didn't really hold the Confederacy accountable, and we allowed statues of Robert E. Lee to remain up throughout much of the South, and probably they're still there. And I guess do you disagree with the assessment that there needs to be this harsh judgment? And if not, how do you square that with your view?
Hi. So it's clear from what we've been talking about that there's such a core part of the Torah values and traditions that really have a lot, that care deeply about these issues. But it seems to me that many parts of the Orthodox world, the modern Orthodox world, the YU world, I went to YU, have kind of lost that. And I feel that we've kind of somehow cut away that core part of the Torah's tradition. We've kind of adopted a certain elitism and supremacy, and I'm curious if you agree, why you think that might be, and ultimately how do you think we can move past that towards what seems like the authentic tradition and values?
Try to make it a question, but Rabbi Berman, especially, it was interesting. You highlighted the Ger being both the stranger and the spiritual and the physical stranger, and I know we are talking about. Maybe it connects to the question from the young man from YU too, but I think in the context also of this greater event. We are connected also to Israel deeply here. We're in the relationships of Gail. What maybe parallels or contrast you see the relationship of American Jewry and Americans to immigrants, refugees here with different peoples in Israel? It's a messy question, big, and you can seize or not any parts of it that resonate.
Thank you so much. Why don't we try to get those questions answered in however way you feel.
Sure. I'll try to keep this short. I think in terms of an action item locally, every Monday evening from 5:30 to 6 at Columbus Circle, there's a multi-faith Monday, Witness to Democracy. People also have been organizing locally at their blocks here on Thursday evenings with just pro-democracy signs or not so much the negativity, but so I think those are local places which I think are easy to meet people who are involved in more national things. In terms of the anger, I get it. And I grew up in Richmond, Virginia. I have a lot of identities. Southern is one of them. It doesn't necessarily come out all that often, unfortunately. But I have a lot of Southern pride by the grace of God. But I don't think the response of slavery or the emancipation is that then we should just reverse the roles, right? And so violence against those, right? So to say that better, when we are fighting for humanity, we can't lose our own in that process, right? And I think it's really important as a proof text. The Yerushalmi says on the pasuk of V'ahavta l'rechamecha, the beginning of that verse of loving our neighbor like we love our friend, or whatever, everyone familiar with that part of the verse. The first part is don't take vengeance, right? And the Yerushalmi gives a great parable about a person who's cutting vegetables or meat, and one hand cuts the other one by accident. So the Gemara says, would the other hand stab the other hand to take revenge? It's the same body, right? So if we see humanity as being interconnected, right? So trying to beat up these people for beating up these people, then we are no different than they are, right? So as the prophetic voice of Michelle Obama said, right? When they go low, right, we have to go high. I'll maybe pass.
Thank you. Yes.
To the YU student, I don't think it's just Jews, though I share your disappointment in the erosion of what I thought were pretty fundamental values, or the complacency of people who I came up with, who seemed to care about the things that I cared about, and I think that's the whole point of this conference. I think with respect to immigration in particular, what we've seen is a lot of people who want to pull up the ladder behind them now that they've gotten in, They want to protect their own. And I think that's a pretty natural human instinct, not necessarily one we should lean into. I think that the narrative and the story and the information that we are required to continue to promote is we need to a liberal society that values the rights of everyone is the liberal society that will protect us as well. We are still other, and you know I think there's a lot of forgive me for being too online, leopard ate my face MAGA voters who who are in couples of mixed status who never imagined that when Trump was broadcasting pretty clearly who he would be going after, that it was them. And I think that's an important thing for all of us to remember how fragile democracy is and our rights are, and to the extent that self-interest is maybe driving people's folding in on themselves, that is something to remember. And then to the person who wants to take out the ICE agents and beat the shit out of them, I too want to do that. And I think that, again, just to return us to some of the themes that came out in the plenary, change is accomplished in different ways, in incremental ways. And I think that there is change, even in the darkest times, in these incremental moments of humanity that we create. The vicarious resistance the vicarious resilience rather, that I get from working with individuals and showing up with them with my humanity and seeing their humanity and having them feel recognized pushes this movement forward. And I think it's not just about doing violence to our enemies.
Thanks so much. Maybe I'll leave the final word to Rabbi Berman, and thank you all for coming. And please grab a sheet if you haven't.
First of all, I just want to agree both with Rabbi Mike and with Zoe and everything that they said. I'd like to just emphasize two things, particularly in terms of what has happened in the Orthodox community, which I think is characteristic of what has happened in the entire country, and that is the absolute victory of materialism. Materialism has been victorious. It has won over, people's moral concerns. It has won over people's religious concerns, and it has corroded the character of the society. Together with that, the loss of sense of national duty, of duty to the well-being of the country and of all of its occupants, which I date in large measure to the end of the national military draft. I hate to say that the army was an instrument of creating a sense of everybody had a national duty, and everybody understood that. And and just because some people could escape because they had no problem with their heel spurs or whatever they're called, doesn't mean that for the other 99.9% of the community, there wasn't this awareness that we all have to share in the responsibility for the protection of the society, and that the gradual development within that of national service options had become extraordinarily important and valuable, and students took pride in doing that, and instead of taking a year to travel in Burma or wherever else it was. I think these are serious losses that our society has, and it's very important to try to rebuild those. But that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Thank you. Big round of applause for everyone here. And for yourselves, thank you for coming. You've taken a huge step. You have the information sheet. There's more you can do. The Jewish Immigration Advocacy Coalition was just founded this week. It includes the New York Jewish Agenda, HIAS, the Synagogue Coalition of the Refugee and Immigrant Crisis, New York Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. Get involved. There's so much we can do. Thank you so much.
It's okay. We are having, thank you. We have Mincha at 3:15. Mechitza is in the middle room and Igal is in the chapel. And we are supposed to reconvene here at 3:30, might be a few minutes later.